would, please open up your Bible to the book of Judges, chapter 5. Judges chapter 5. Before we get started this morning, does anybody have any Bible questions? Okay, so in our study of Old Testament characters, we have been taking a look here at Deborah and how she led the children of Israel, and she encouraged them to volunteer to fight against the Philistines. And they had, I believe it was 10,000 volunteers that rose up and went against the Philistines and was able to conquer them with hardly any trouble whatsoever. The reason why this was such an astonishing feat, if you recall, is because the Philistines, if you look back at chapter 4, the Philistines had, not the Philistines, that's Samson. But this group here, they had 900 iron chariots, if you look at verse 3 of Judges chapter 4. So Judges chapter 4, we have Jabin, the king of Canaan. He reigned in Hazor, and he had 900 iron chariots. Now Deborah, she was a prophetess and a judge in Israel at the time, and she summoned this man named Barak, and they banded together and encouraged the children of Israel to go and fight against this individual. And you recall the gruesome end that he met at the hands of the woman in the tent, with the the tent stake and the things, the hammer and things like that. So what we were looking at in Judges 5 at the end of last week was this long song that Deborah and Barak give to praise the people of Israel for being willing to volunteer to fight against this king, and also praising God for his willingness to fight with Israel to overcome this oppressor. Now, what's really interesting about this is that Israel had a chariot problem. They were sometimes not the most excited to go into war because of the chariots that they had to fight against. If you go back to Judges chapter 1, we're going to take a look at a couple of passages along this line. Go back in your Bible to Judges chapter 1. Judges chapter 1 and verse 19. The scripture says this: Now the Lord was with Judah, and they took possession of the hill country, but they could not drive out the inhabitants of the valley, because they had iron chariots. So this group here in the valley, apparently, as sort of as it threatened to do in the chapter we're looking at, Judges 4, the group here in the valley had these iron chariots, and it discouraged Israel to the point where even though God was willing to fight with them, they weren't able to take the valley, even though they were able to take the hill country. So Israel was scared to death of these iron chariots. At least it seems like it was here in Judges chapter 1. Now, of course, one of the reasons why Israel would have been afraid of the iron chariots is because the iron chariot was the chariot was a staple of the Egyptian army, if you recall. In fact, whenever Israel left Egypt, what did Pharaoh and his armies do? Chase them with iron chariots. Now, you would think that what happened in the Red Sea would obliterate any fear that Israel had of any army, especially any armies with iron chariots. And yet, here's a point in Israel's history where God's promised them to take the Canaan land. He said, all this is yours. I'm going to go before you. I'm going to fight these people in battle for you. And yet, when it comes to this situation here in the valley with the iron chariots, they weren't able to drive them out. They must have been terrified of them. So, what, Ashley?
I had a note on that. It said Canaanite chariots pulled by horses were among the most sophisticated weapons of the day. Israelite foot soldiers were absolutely powerless when a speeding iron chariot bore down upon them. This is why Israel preferred to fight in the hills where chariots couldn't venture.
That's good. I was trying to find a stat, but I couldn't find it anywhere online. What one iron chariot was worth to so many foot soldiers, but I couldn't find any equivalent data. John,
you made mention, I think you were on that one last week that those iron chariots, they had those things attached to the wheel with the blades on it.
Right.
They just ran through the soldiers and just cut them up.
Right, you've probably seen that on some of the movies too. That picture like Greek and Roman wars. It's devastating, right? But I was trying to find a stat. How many iron chariots? What was the equivalency of one iron chariot to so many foot soldiers? But I guess the best way to think about it is if a tank was going through town and all we had was common hunting rifles and things like that. What could we do against something like that? And that's how Israel viewed the iron chariots, right? They viewed them as something that was unget-overable. But what's amazing is that in Israel's history, she had overcome iron chariots so many times with the Red Sea, and even later on in her history, you have David going against 10,000 chariots of the Philistines, and Saul facing all these chariots of the Philistines, and they conquered them again and again and again because God was with them. But here, for some reason, there's a hiccup in Judges chapter 1 where Israel is scared to death of these iron chariots. So when we look at Judges chapter 4, we have this period of 20 years, Judges 4 and verse 3, where Israel is being oppressed by this particular king who had 900 iron chariots. And it was this female leader named Deborah who was able to overcome this and lead the people in a fight against this king and won Israel back from her oppressors. I'll go take care of that. The back door's swinging open. I'll go shut it real quick. I don't want it to swing open and break the glass or something like that. You're welcome. All right, so my granddad always asked us, we come in the classroom for Bible class on Wednesday nights, and he would always ask, were you raised in a barn? If we left the classroom door open. But the thing is if you shut the door, he would say, are you not expecting any visitors? And so you couldn't win either way. What are you supposed to do? So, all right. So Deborah and Barak lead this charge against these, armies filled with chariots to overcome them and lead Israel out of oppression once again. Now, of course, Israel would quickly fall into sin. Just shortly after this takes place with Micah and the idols in chapter 6, but that's a story for another day. Let's take a look at some things about these iron chariots. I got a couple verses that I want to show you. The first one comes from the book of Deuteronomy. So let's go back to Deuteronomy, and we're going to go to chapter 20 and verse 1. See, you just have to trust your instincts. I knew it was chapter 20, but I should have just gone there, but I wanted to double check before I told you what chapter it was. Deuteronomy chapter 20. I thought it was a sort of a coincidence because we're going to go to Psalm 20 in a few seconds. So Deuteronomy 20 verse 1 says this: when you go out to battle against your enemies and see horses and chariots and people more numerous than you, do not be afraid of them, for the Lord your God, who brought you up from the land of Egypt, is with you. When you are approaching the battle, the priest shall come near and speak to the people. He shall say to them, Hear, O Israel, you are approaching the battle against your enemies today. Do not be faint-hearted, do not be afraid, or panic, or tremble before them, for the Lord your God is the one who goes with you to fight for you against your enemies to save you. So they weren't supposed to be afraid. From the very beginning, Moses had told them, you're going to see people with iron chariots, you're going to see people that are more numerous than you. Don't worry, because you've got the greatest power of all on your side, God. And yet when we come to Judges 1, they go into the valleys where these iron chariots thrive, as Ashley pointed out from her footnotes in the Bible, and they can't do it. They can't drive them out. And all it took was a strong leader like Deborah and Barak from Judges chapter 4 to influence the people to go and to conquer this army. Notice the instructions in Deuteronomy chapter 20. He tells the priest that the priest needs to go out in verse 3 and encourage the people, remind them that God was fighting with them. In verse 5, the text says, the officers also shall speak to the people, saying, who is the man that has built a new house and has not dedicated it? Let him depart and return to his house, otherwise he might die in the battle, and another man would dedicate it. And then he goes on and talks about how they need to go and take care of their business. But also notice verse 8. Then the officers will also speak further to the people and say, who is the man that is afraid and faint-hearted? Let him depart and return to his house, so that he might not make his brother's heart melt like his heart. So notice again, this is kind of like what you see in Judges 4 and 5. Those who fought in Israel's armies when they were going into the land of Canaan were on a volunteer basis. And those who did fight, they had all their affairs in order back home, but also they had complete and total faith in God. They weren't supposed to be afraid, they weren't supposed to be faint-hearted at all. They just had to completely trust in God. If they listened to the words of the priest, then they should have been able to go in and take Canaan no problem. Now, one thing that's interesting about this is how quickly this idea was lost in Israel's history. If Moses lived around 1500 BC and David lived around 1000, so just about 500 years, what happened with David and Goliath? What was going on right before David showed up to take care of Goliath? The people were terrified, right? Terrified of Goliath. See, they'd completely forgotten about this system of, hey, remind everybody, if you're too afraid to go in and fight, if you forgot the Lord's on your side, then you just stay home. We don't need you here bringing down the morale. And so when you look at Israel past the death of Moses and the death of Joshua, and besides a few spots where real important leaders rose up like Deborah and David and others, you have really a lack of faith amongst the people of Israel, which is one of the reasons why they were conquered so many times, is they forgot that God was with them. Does anybody have any comments on that?
The idol worship was in play at that point as well, right?
Right. So that was one of the things that Israel did when you have that routine in the book of Judges.
Right.
Because
I'm just thinking, that's probably one of the main reasons why, they forgot to remind each other, or they, lost faith, because you get distracted with other things, and then you lose sight or forget, what got you, what's brought you through. So, thus far, you find yourself in a world of trouble. It's kind of like us today, one day turned into two turned into a week. You ain't open your Bible, or you're not praying like you normally do it. And the least little thing somebody say or do, you all in the uproar, and then you're like, man, why did I read like that? And you think about it, it's like, man, I've been off track,
Right.
So
If
I
you-
can see that happening.
Yeah, if you lose sight of your priorities, you can fall into that sort of Judges state. John?
Ashley mentioned about the idols that they were worshiping. It was because of the land that they was in. So God delivered them from. Now these are not the original people that came out of Egypt. Their foreparents were in Egypt. But
Right.
when they went into this Canaan land, they were supposed to be running all these people out, the Gentiles out, but they didn't. So when they were surrounding them, that's what they see, and they begin to pick up some of the same things they doing, just like Christians today. Because I was surrounded, we begin to pick up some of the same things that the world are doing.
Exactly, and that was one of the consequences they had to face for not following the Lord's commands and driving all the people out. The Philistines were a thorn in their side for years and years and years. And then, of course, even later on, whenever Saul is given a chance to drive the people out, before him again, he doesn't do it still. He only does a halfway job and doesn't follow through with all the commands that God had given him. And so that came back to bite him quite a bit in the future. Anybody else have any comments? All right, so I mentioned one of Israel's more prominent leaders was David. Let's see what he had to say about chariots in Psalm chapter 20. Psalm chapter 20 and verse 7. We'll read verses 6 through 9. Psalm chapter 20, verses 6 through 9. David says this, "Now I know that the Lord saves his anointed. He will answer him from his holy heaven with the saving strength of his right hand. Some boast in chariots and some in horses, but we will boast in the name of the Lord our God. They have bowed down and fallen, but we have risen and stood upright. Save, O Lord, may the King answer us in the day we call." So this is David. One thing that's interesting is he's recognizing God as king when he's one of Israel's most mighty kings that ever existed. As the people, saying, Saul has slain his thousands, David his 10,000s. And here he is calling God king. Truly one of the great people of Israel's history. But if you notice in verse 7 particularly, he says, "Some boast in chariots, some in horses, but we boast in the name of the Lord our God." So he understood who it was that led him into battle, and which is why he was able to conquer Goliath, why he was able to save his sheep from the various predators that he had to interact with, and why he was able to do so much good during his time as king, because he, like Deborah and Barak and these volunteers that you read about in Judges 4 and 5, they had their faith not in the weapons that they had, but in the God that they served. And this serves as a good example in our life. We might not really worry about iron chariots like they did, but we have our own problems that we face, and we have our own, sort of fears and things that easily beset us. But with God on our side, we can conquer all. And this is what you have laid out as an example in the Old Testament. I was laughing because I remember last night we saw a sign at I was sitting back with Miss Bonnie, and we saw a sign that said, the Christmas parade was luau themed or Hawaiian themed, which I thought was hilarious, given that it's Christmas. But it's like 70, 75 degrees out. I've never been to a Christmas parade that was so warm outside.
That's why it was a aloha theme.
Right, exactly. But one sign said, "Surfing for Jesus and fishing for men." Yeah, fishing for souls or something. And when I first read it, I read "suffering for Jesus and fishing for souls." And I looked at Laura and I was like, what a weird float, suffering for Jesus and fishing for souls. But while I was laughing about that, it's because one of the things about it is I said, I thought the whole purpose of Jesus was coming so we didn't have to suffer. No more tears, no more death. And then I realized, oh wait, it says surfing for Jesus. Okay, maybe surfing isn't the same as suffering. But reading that there made me remember that was funny. Also, somebody gave me a tract last night, and it was that Roman Road, the salvation tract you get sometimes, and it said send your phone number in and your address, and we'll take care of you. But there wasn't any return address on it at all, where to send it to. And I told Laura, this must be like a Santa Claus thing. You drop it in the mailbox, and it just knows where to go. So if you missed out on a lot of fun at the Christmas parade last night. Plus, we had Jaden bringing us candy. He was on the front, we were behind him, so he kept bringing us peppermints and stuff. All right, so here we have the people that trust in chariots instead of in God. And luckily, we had leaders like Deborah and Barak that lived in Israel's history to take care of that. Let's go to Judges chapter 5, and let's take a look at some of these notes from this prayer. One thing that we looked at a lot of this last week, but notice verse 4 and 5 of Judges 5, just to bring this out again. Now remember, this is one of the earlier records of Israel's history. Particularly Deborah, she would have lived, this is before Saul, this is shortly after Joshua's death, all right? So this is real early in Israel's history. And this is what she says in Judges chapter 5, verse 4 and 5. "Lord, you went out from Seir, you marched from the field of Edom. The earth quaked, the heavens also dripped, even the clouds dripped water. The mountains quaked or flowed at the presence of the Lord. This Sinai, at the presence of the Lord, the God of Israel." So verses 4 and 5, you have this idea that when they went out to battle, they saw that is the Lord, marching around on the earth, causing the earth to quake and the heavens to drip and the mountains to quake. So you have this same sort of language that's used in the New Testament, particularly in Revelation. I mean, if you read Revelation, they have more earthquakes than Alaska, right? I don't know if you heard about that on Friday or not, the 7-point whatever magnitude earthquake. But in Revelation, you have all these earthquakes that happen. And we see one of the sources for that right here in in Judges chapter 5. It's talking about God leading a military conquest through providence or what have you to deliver his people from oppression. By the way, did you know that there was not one lost life in Alaska? That's how far the science has progressed to be able to resist those earthquakes. Hopefully we got some sort of science to help us do that against hurricanes, which seems like one of the best is, hey, you need to leave when it says there's one coming to you. But not everybody can do that. But still, Judges chapter 5, we have one of the sources for these earthquake passages in Revelation. You know, this is where this imagery is starting to be used to describe God being with his people. Go down a little bit more. You have a lot of repetition in this chapter, things that we noticed last week. There's one more though, verse. All right, get past all. See, in verses 14 through verse 18, it's basically repetition, where he's describing each tribe and sort of what they did. But notice down there, verse 19. He says this: the kings came and fought the kings of Canaan at Tanakh near the waters of Megiddo. They took no plunder in silver. The stars fought from heaven. From their courses they fought against Sisera. So you have these stars fighting from heaven. Again, sort of just an imagery there. And if you think about what stars represent in the New Testament, a lot of the times has reference to kings and princes. For example, thinking back to Joseph in his dream, he saw the sun and the moon and the stars bow down before him. The sun being the father, the moon being the mother, and then the stars being his brothers. So if you think about it in sort of monarchy sort of way, you have the king, the queen, and then the princes. And so in the New Testament, in Matthew chapter 24 and verse 29, you have there the sun turning to darkness, the moon turning to blood, the stars falling from heaven. Same imagery is used here, except in this place, the stars are going out to fight. Now, if you think about that, it's kind of when you literally picture the stars going out to fight, it's kind of knowing what we know about stars is kind of silly, right? Because stars, if a star came to the earth, it'd burn it up, right? Because most stars are far bigger than the earth is. And so here, though, in verse 20, the stars are fighting from heaven. From their courses, they fought against Sisera. So you have this sort of minute but present apocalyptic or figurative language that's already being used in Israel's history, all the way back here in Judges chapter 4 and 5. And the New Testament writers would have been intimately aware of all this language that's used. Again, the Bereans, when they searched the scriptures daily, they weren't searching the pocket New King James Version, right? They were searching the Old Testament scriptures, most likely the Greek versions of the Old Testament scriptures. And this is some of the stuff that they would have read, that they would have been able to see used in the apostles' letters as well. All right, let's see. Look at verse 24. I got some more chariot verses I want to share with you in a little bit, but let's keep looking here. Most blessed of women, verse 24, is Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite. Most blessed is she of a woman in the tent. He asked for water, and she gave him milk. In a magnificent bowl she brought him curds. She reached out her hand for the tent peg and her right hand for the workman's hammer. Then she struck Sisera, she smashed his head, and she shattered and pierced his temple. What a beautiful song. That's what this all is a song that they sang. You wouldn't want to sing that one on Sunday morning if Johnny got up and led that before Bible class. It was for them, that's right. Not for Sisera, though. Hopefully he enjoyed the milk, or the curds, right? Between her feet he bowed, he fell, he lay. Between her feet he bowed, he fell. Where he bowed, there he fell dead. Out of the windows she looked and lamented, the mother of Sisera through the lattice. Why does his chariot delay in coming? Why do the hoofbeats of his chariot tarry? What a sad picture to put at the end of that. Even though this is war, and they all know the dangers and possibilities affiliated with fighting in a battle like this, she thinks to, I guess she's a woman here, she's married, and, she has a husband. It's Israel, so she most likely has children, at least if she was not barren. And as that sort of motherly figure, even if she doesn't have children, she still might have those motherly instincts, And here she thinks about the soldier's mother at the end of this song. Sort of a touching, you don't really think about David writing about all these of the war, their parents. But here she is commenting on the mother of this individual. Her princes would answer her, verse 29. Indeed, she repeats her words to herself. Are they not finding? Are they not dividing the spoil? A maiden, 2 maidens for every warrior. To Sisera, a spoil of dyed work. A spoil of dyed work embroidered. Dyed work of double embroidery on the neck of the spoiler. So she's at home basically saying they must be spending he must be taking a while because he's finding all these good treasures to collect. And here's the conclusion. Thus let all your enemies perish, O Lord. But let those who love him be like the rising of the sun in its might. And the land was undisturbed for 40 years. It just sort of gives you chills when you read that, because she includes all the emotions that come with the war. The joy that all these individuals were willing to volunteer and to contribute to the fight. The praise to God for fighting with them and going before them and destroying their enemies. But also she recognizes the darker things associated with war. How the person on the other end has a life and a family and a home that is also is going to be mourning over their loss. So it's really tough to read and hard to swallow. And we make little jokes here and there, I guess, to try to ignore the pain that exists within this chapter. But notice verse 31. This is really cool. Let those who love him be like the rising sun in its might. All right? So, I've already mentioned the apocalyptic language that's associated, or that's found within this chapter. The earth quaking, the mountains, flowing, things like that. We noticed later on the stars going out and fighting. Go to Matthew chapter 13. Matthew chapter 13. Here, we're going to go here because we could go to Daniel, but we're just going to knock it out in one passage instead of 2. In Matthew chapter 13 and verse 43, Jesus is quoting from Daniel chapter 12, and I believe it's verse 3. Matthew 13, verse 43, Jesus quotes from Daniel 12 and verse 3. This is him explaining the parable of the wheat and the tares. We talked about this last week, but notice what he says in verse 43. Then the righteous will shine forth as the sun in the kingdom of their Father. He who has ears, let him hear. So this idea of shining forth as the sun, it doesn't have to do with one's physical appearance, like bright clothing, or like a raptured body, that kind of thing, right? Instead, it has to do with victory in war, is what we read about in Judges chapter 5, right? And so when you read about this shining like the sun, shining like the stars in heaven, previous years we might have thought about that as being transfigured to look kind of like Jesus does in Revelation chapter 1, with the shining face and things like that, the halo and the harp and etc., right? But that's not what shining like the sun has reference to. Way back in Judges chapter 5, one of the earliest books in Israel's history, has this meaning simply conquering in battle, winning war over the enemies. And so in Matthew 13, that's exactly what it is. The wheat have overcome the tares in the kingdom of God, and so they shine forth like the sun. Just a common expression used in Israel's history to talk about winning war. All right? Any thoughts on that?
Shining at the sun, I get called like standing out, be observed, be seen.
Right, exactly. That's good. Exactly. And so you have that imagery of in 2 Peter 1 when the day star rises. When the day star rises in your hearts. And so the full revelation of Jesus. That's good. Anybody else? So, you got to read the whole Bible. Because if you don't read Judges and you come to Matthew 13 and you read about the sun shining and things like that, you might kind of get confused about what that's talking about. And yet here you go all the way back in the Old Testament. The answers to these questions that we might ask ourselves about the Bible are right there, plain as day. When you read Judges chapter 5 and verse 31, nobody thinks that it's talking about a transfigured body or a resurrected body or something like that. They simply see it's a symbol of victory. And that's all it is in Matthew 13 as well. All right. Yes, ma'am, Ms. Donna.
A lot of what we read about those battles, we look upon those today as something in the physical sense, and yet maybe some more so. But looking through it all, we can see spiritually that was alluding to the fall of Jerusalem itself and the brightness of the sun, if you will, was bringing about the new birth of the church.
Oh, yes, for sure.
That we know it to be.
For sure. And in Matthew 13 especially, it's more of a spiritual warfare, right? That's represented physically through the fall of Jerusalem. That's a good point. So it's a winning of a battle regardless of the nature of the battle, right? And certainly a spiritual warfare is spiritual victory, and warfare is greater than any. One thing to note about that is that even in Israel's history, the physical warfare that they fought was really a spiritual battle as well, when you really get down to it. Why was Israel oppressed? Because of sin. How would she conquer? Through repenting and trusting in God once more. So you see, this whole warfare thing that you read about in the Old Testament is physical on the surface, but has a spiritual meaning right beneath the surface. And when you look back in the book of Deuteronomy, and I didn't pull this verse for today, I didn't see it, I didn't think about it until just now, but you look back in Deuteronomy, and what did God say over and over? You're not going to go in here and fight these wars because you're great or because you're righteous. Look at all the bad stuff you've done. Don't think that about yourself. But you're going to go fight all these wars and conquer because I'm with you and I'm going before you. And these people have sinned, and we're going to bring about judgment upon them. And so everything in the Bible is really spiritual. There's focus on the physical in the Old Testament, but even down to the sacrifices that they offered, they were meant to be spiritual things. But what had happened is they just got caught up in the physical aspect of it. Sort of what the whole thing with Jesus condemning them in the New Testament is. They put too much focus on the physical. Let's see. Anybody? I want to show you a couple more chariot verses before we close. Don't you hate it whenever an app updates on your phone or on your tablet and all your buttons get mixed around and you click on stuff here and it goes over there? Man, I can't stand it. Just leave it like it always has been. Which I guess if we say that about everything, we'll never progress, will we? Maybe this button layout is better and I just haven't figured it out yet. But as of right now. All right, go to the book of Psalms, and we're going to look at three quick verses. The first one is Psalm 46 and verse 9. Psalm 46 and verse 9. Okay, Psalm 46. We'll read verses 8 through 11. He says this: Come, behold the works of the Lord, who has wrought desolations in the earth. He makes wars to cease to the end of the earth. He breaks the bow and cuts the spear in two. He burns the chariots with fire. Cease striving and know that I am the Lord. I'll be exalted among the nations. I'll be exalted in the earth. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our stronghold. Psalm 46, 8 through 11. the idea here is that it's not mine. I've checked. But the idea here is that God is able to conquer all. And so basically the encouragement here is, you put down your weapons of war. Those things aren't going to save you. God's going to save you. He's going to be the one to go before you. He says in verse 10, "Cease striving and know that I am the Lord. I'll be exalted among the nations. I'll be exalted in the earth." And so basically here the idea is the natural progression of the world leads to God conquering all. And so you need to cease striving and put your faith in God. All right? A couple more verses to look at real quick is Psalm, scroll back down here in my notes. Psalm chapter 104, verse 3. Psalm 104, verse 3. This passage will seem mighty familiar to you, at least the language that's used in it. I will begin in verse 1 and go to verse 4. He says this: "Bless the Lord, O my soul. O Lord my God, you are very great. You are clothed with splendor and majesty, covering yourself with light as with a cloak, stretching out heaven like a tent curtain. He lays the beams of his upper chambers in the waters. He makes the clouds his chariot. He walks upon the wings of the wind. He makes the wind his messengers, flaming fire his ministers." And so here you have some of the language that's used in the New Testament is described here in Psalm chapter, 104. But the thing to note, it makes the clouds his chariot. So when the New Testament talks about the Lord coming on a fast cloud, the coming on the clouds, things like that, simply talking about God coming in battle to conquer his enemies. And so this is just one of the many passages in the Old Testament that is overlooked when studying New Testament language in terms of prophecy. Also notice here the temple language that's used. So you have this idea of stretching out heaven like a tent curtain, and then his upper chambers in the waters, things like this. So you have this idea that creation itself sort of serves as God's temple in a sense. But that's probably a story for another day. Let's see. There was one more I wanted to show you, I think. At least I think I said I'll show you 3, right? The last one was Psalm 68 and verse 17 is the last mention of chariots in the book of Psalms. Psalm 68 verse 17. If I said 4, the other one we already looked at was Psalm 20. All right? Psalm 68, we're going to look at verses 15 through 18. "A mountain of God is the mountain of Bashan. A mountain of many peaks is the mountain of Bashan. Why do you look with envy, O mountains with many peaks, at the mountain which God has desired for his abode? Surely the Lord will dwell there forever. The chariots of God are myriads, thousands upon thousands. The Lord is among them as at Sinai in holiness. You have ascended on high, you've led captive your captives. You've received gifts among men, even among the rebellious also, that the Lord God may dwell there." By the way, that's quoted in Ephesians chapter 4, and I think it's verse 8. Don't quote me on that, but it's Ephesians 4 for sure. Do it? It is verse 8. High five myself. But here in Psalm 68, the idea, God's chariots are thousands upon thousands. So you think about all the chariots that Israel had to fight, none of them had more strength than God. That's a glorious thought. And so Israel had nothing to fear, and yet they did. They did fear, despite having no need to worry. And isn't that kind of a description of us? We have no need to worry, yet how much do we do it? Here, right? I think we've all been there at some point in our life. But Deborah and Barak in Judges chapter 4 and 5, they had faith. They conquered. But it wasn't them that conquered, it was God. And of course, we talked about last week, through Christ, we've all been made more than conquerors. And so there's no reason us to fear iron chariots or anything else, right? Who's elected, politics, fighting, division in the country, all that kind of stuff. At the end of the day, we're still Christians, and we have heaven as our home. And if the country burns down, we have a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens, right? So sometimes you might sort of get down about things, how things are going in the world, but things have been going bad in the world for a long, long time. But something good is also going in the world, and maybe it's time to stop striving, as the one psalm said, and put our faith in God, right? Okay, that is Deborah and Barak, Judges 4 and 5. Some of the good thing about her, as we mentioned, is some of the language that's used in the song that is described in Judges 5 is the same kind of stuff we find in the parables and in Revelation, and isn't that just neat? So, a very important character in Jewish history that conquered the chariots. All right, we'll stop there and start back in about 10 minutes. Well, that's just what my title and my...
Mine too.